Welcome to The Secret Case. Today we are going to dive into one of the most shocking and horrendous cases of recent years in Mexico, the case of Magdalena Aguilar. A case that is not only known for the brutality with which the crime was committed, but also for the complexity of the events surrounding it and the social context that surrounds it. Magdalena Aguilar was the victim of a terrible act of violence, but her story goes far beyond the headlines. It is a story of injustice, inequality, and the failure of the system to protect those who need it most. Before we dive into the details of this heartbreaking case, I'd like to pause for a moment to tell you something important. 95% of the people who watch our videos are not subscribed to our channel. If you enjoy these in-depth analyses and want to support our work, please consider subscribing. It's free and it helps us a lot to continue bringing you quality content. Now, let's get started. To better understand Magdalena Aguilar's case, it is essential to examine her story from the beginning. Magdalena was born into a humble home in Mexico. She did not have a particularly happy childhood, and from a very young age, she had to learn to face life in a resilient way. Her family struggled to get by, like so many other lower-class families in a country where opportunities can be limited, especially for women. She grew up in an environment where opportunities for study and development were scarce, which forced Magdalena to start working at a very young age. Her parents, although not violent, lacked the resources to provide her with the education and emotional tools necessary to cope with the difficulties that would come later in her life. Despite these limitations, Magdalena developed an optimistic personality and a strong work ethic, traits that would accompany her throughout her life. However, this lack of a safe and stable environment influenced the decisions he would make later on, especially regarding his personal relationships. It is at this point that we begin to see the first signs of what would be a life marked by tragedy and violence. Already in her youth, Magdalena began to have romantic relationships, and like many young women who have grown up in difficult environments, she tended to look to her partners for the security and support she had not had at home. This need for emotional security led her to form a relationship with Cesar Gomez, a man who, at first, seemed to be her refuge in the midst of the storm. However, it soon became clear that Cesar was not the man Magdalena thought he was. The relationship with Cesar was marked by manipulation and control. Cesar had a jealous and possessive personality, and although at first Magdalena tried to please him, things quickly began to deteriorate. As their relationship progressed, tensions became evident. Magdalena, for her part, tried to maintain the relationship, partly because they wanted to raise their children together. They had 2 sons, who quickly became the center of her life. Despite Magdalena's efforts to maintain peace in her home, constant fights and episodes of domestic violence ended up breaking up the relationship. Finally, after years of abuse and humiliation, Magdalena decided that the best thing for her and her children was to separate from Cesar. This decision, which was taken as an act of bravery and self-preservation, would trigger a series of events that would culminate in tragedy. On January 27, 2018, Magdalena Aguilar disappeared without a trace. She had gone to pick up her children from the house of her ex-partner, Cesar, who was supposed to take care of them during that weekend. However, after that meeting, no one heard from her again. This was the beginning of a desperate search by her family, who, having heard nothing from her, feared the worst. The police were quickly alerted to her disappearance, but as is the case with many missing women, the authorities' initial reaction was slow. In Mexico, the disappearance of women is a constant reality, and investigations are often not taken with the necessary urgency. Magdalena's family pressured local authorities to take swift action, but the days passed without any clear leads. Finally, on February 7, 2018, a gruesome discovery was made that would change the course of the investigation. Magdalena's body was found dismembered in a cave near the city of Tasca in the state of Guerrero. Not only was this a brutal murder, but it was also learned that some parts of her body had been cooked, adding a level of horror and revulsion to an already gruesome case. The brutality of the crime committed against Magdalena Aguilar shocked all of Mexico. The discovery of her dismembered body cooked in a pot left the community, and the entire country, speechless. Authorities confirmed that her ex-partner, Cesar Gomez, had been the author of this horrible act. He was accused not only of murdering her, but also of trying to hide the crime in the most atrocious way. Forensic analysis revealed that Magdalena had been murdered shortly after arriving at Caesar's house to pick up her children. After committing the murder, Caesar dismembered her body and cooked some parts, supposedly with the intention of making the evidence disappear. This type of macabre behavior is extremely rare and not only reflects physical violence, but also an attempt to dehumanize the victim in the cruelest act possible. This crime was not only devastating for Magdalena's family, but also generated a wave of indignation throughout the country. Human rights organizations and feminist groups raised their voices to denounce Magdalena's femicide, which became part of a long list of atrocious crimes committed against women in Mexico. The case was widely covered by local and international media, describing it as one of the most shocking in the country's recent history. The question many were asking was, how was it possible for something so horrible to happen without anyone being able to prevent it? This case exposed, once again, the flaws of a system that is not prepared to protect women from domestic violence. From the beginning of the investigation, the authorities focused their attention on Cesar Gomez, since he was the last person who had seen Magdalena alive and, in addition, there was a history of violence in their relationship. Despite this, Cesar tried to evade justice. After Magdalena's body was found, Cesar disappeared and was on the run for several days, which only increased the suspicions against him. The search for Cesar was complex. Alerts were activated nationwide, and Guerrero authorities coordinated a special operation to capture him. Finally, Cesar was located and arrested on the outskirts of Tasca, where he was trying to hide. He was brought to justice and formally charged with femicide. Cesar Gomez's trial was closely followed by the press and the general public. During the proceedings, he showed very little emotion or remorse for his actions, which only increased the outrage of those following the case. In the end, Cesar was sentenced to prison, but this verdict was not enough to ease the pain of Magdalena's family or calm the anger of those calling for justice for all victims of femicide in Mexico. The femicide of Magdalena Aguilar was not just an individual act of extreme violence, it also highlighted a much larger problem in Mexican society: gender violence. This case became a symbol of femicide and impunity in Mexico, a country where every day more women lose their lives at the hands of their partners or ex-partners. The impact of this case was so great that marches and demonstrations were organized throughout the country in memory of Magdalena and all women who have been victims of femicide. Feminist groups and human rights organizations demanded that the Mexican government take stronger measures to protect women and eradicate gender violence. In addition, this case raised serious questions about the effectiveness of the authorities in preventing. The case of Magdalena Aguilar exposed a series of failures in the Mexican justice system. It is not only the brutality of the crime that shook society, but also the chain of omissions and negligence that allowed this to happen. Throughout Magdalena's relationship with Cesar, there were clear signs of violence and abuse, but as happens in many cases of domestic violence, these signs were ignored or underestimated by the authorities. Mexico faces a crisis in protecting women from gender-based violence. Despite having laws that are, in theory, designed to protect women, the implementation of these laws is poor. Magdalena never received the support she needed from the authorities, despite the danger signs that existed in her relationship with Cesar. Domestic violence cases are often not taken seriously until it is too late. This creates a cycle of impunity and violence that continues to claim lives. In Magdalena's case, her tragic end could have been avoided if the system had intervened at the crucial moments. Unfortunately, her case is just one among thousands of women who suffer violence in their homes on a daily basis, without receiving timely help. Today, Cesar Gomez is still serving his sentence in prison. He has shown no remorse for what he did, and for many, this behavior reflects the deep dehumanization he suffered towards women. Meanwhile, Magdalena's family continues to deal with the pain of their loss, seeking to find justice beyond the simple imprisonment of her killer. In Mexican society, the case of Magdalena Aguilar was one of the catalysts that drove legislative changes. New laws have been introduced that seek to protect women from gender violence, and mechanisms for responding to complaints of domestic violence have been improved. However, the results of these changes are still not sufficient. Despite progress, Mexico continues to face a serious crisis of femicides. Magdalena's case is no exception, and many other women continue to suffer in silence, trapped in cycles of violence from which it is often impossible to escape without intervention by the authorities. The fight for justice and protection of women continues. The femicide of Magdalena Aguilar is one of many reminders that gender violence is a systemic problem that requires urgent attention from all sectors of society. Her story is heartbreaking, but it must continue to be told so that victims are not forgotten and so that measures continue to be taken to protect women from violence. Magdalena's story invites us to reflect on the importance of listening to, supporting, and believing in women who ask for help. It reminds us that gender violence is a daily reality for millions of women, and that we cannot allow these tragedies to continue to occur. Every life that is lost is a wake-up call to act. Please, if this topic has touched you in any way, consider sharing this video so that more people know about Magdalena's story and what she represents. Also, if you haven't already, remember that 95% of the people who watch our videos are not subscribers. Subscribing is completely free and allows us to continue creating content that brings these stories to light. Just click the subscribe button and activate the notification bell. Together, we can make a difference. Magdalena Aguilar, like many other victims of femicide, should not have died in such a violent and cruel way. However, her legacy has served to expose the deep flaws of the system and give voice to thousands of women who have been victims of violence. Her name has become a symbol of the fight for justice and equality, and her story will continue to remind us of the importance of protecting those who are in danger. At the end of the day, Magdalena was not just a victim, she was a brave woman seeking a better life for herself and her children. Although her life was cut short in an atrocious manner, her case prompted many to question passivity in the face of gender violence. Her memory forces us to ask ourselves what we are doing to prevent more women from living the same fate. Magdalena's legacy should be a call to action for all of society, to demand fairer laws, to raise awareness about gender violence, and, above all, to never forget that behind every case there is a person who deserved a dignified and safe life. Remembering her name is the first step towards change.